chest height for me back then, so I had to really hoist myself up. I remember the rough wood against my palms, the cold night air hitting my face, and the strange silence outside. And that's the last thing I remember, until the next morning. I woke up sometime later to my parents yelling. I was lying on the ground outside, right below my bedroom window, curled up in the mulch of my mom's flower bed. The fall wasn't far. Our house was a single story, but I was confused and disoriented. I was freezing cold too, my pajamas damp with morning dew, and there were small scratches on my arms and face from the holly bush I'd apparently landed in. When my parents found me, I asked my mom why she wanted me to sleep outside last night. The look on her face is something I'll never forget. Pure confusion with traces of fear. The poor woman had no idea what I was talking about. My dad picked me up and carried me inside while Mom checked me for injuries. They kept asking how I got outside, if I'd climbed out the window myself, if I'd been sleepwalking. I just told them. Mom came to my room and told me to follow her out the window. My parents were visibly shaken. They looked at each other. Then my mom said, "Honey, I was in bed all night. I never came into your room." My dad had a look at my window. It was still open, but no signs of damage or forced entry. For weeks afterward, they checked my window every night to make sure it was locked. And eventually my dad nailed it shut. As I got older, I mostly forgot about that incident. My parents worked through their problems when I was around 7. Dad got a better job with better hours, and they started to do marriage counseling at the church. By the time I was 12 years old, they seemed happier than ever. They went on regular date nights every Friday, leaving me with my older cousin Melissa as a babysitter. When they weren't on dates, they were either working or busy around the house. Dad with yard work, Mom with cleaning and cooking. At 12, I was going through my own issues. Middle school was tough. I was smaller for my age, and I was getting picked on. I didn't have many friends, and the ones I did have were starting to get into sports and girls, neither of which interested me yet. I spent most of my time playing video games or reading comic books in my room. I started to feel neglected, though I didn't have the emotional vocabulary to describe it that way back then. I simply knew that whenever I tried to talk to my parents about school or ask them to play a game with me, they seemed distracted. "Not now, honey," or "Can it wait until after dinner?" were phrases I heard daily. I felt very lonely and left out of their lives. So one Friday in late September, when I knew they had plans to go out that evening, I decided to run away. Not for real, just for a day, to make them worry and maybe pay more attention to me. I wasn't really thinking through the consequences or how stupid and dangerous it would be. In my 12-year-old mind, it was the master plan. The plan was to stay up all night so I could sneak out at sunrise before they woke up. I would have set an alarm, but it was loud and didn't work half the time. I packed up some snacks in my backpack, a sleeve of saltine crackers and a couple of granola bars, and a bottle of water. I also grabbed my Game Boy Advance, a flashlight, my favorite comic book, and a light jacket in case it got cold. I didn't take much else. I was planning to come home the next day, after all, and I was a kid who didn't understand what I was doing. Around 5:30 a.m., when the sky was just starting to lighten, I snuck out the back door and headed for the woods behind our property. The morning was cool and misty, still dark enough that I needed my flashlight to see the path. Within moments, dew had soaked through my sneakers, so that sucked. I walked about a half-mile in to a spot where I could still see our house if I positioned myself right. There was this big oak tree there that I liked to climb sometimes, and I settled myself underneath it. I spent the morning playing Pokemon on my Game Boy, eating crackers and feeling pretty pleased with myself, imagining how worried my parents were going to be and how they were going to apologize over and over for not spending enough time with me. As the morning went on, I got bored. I tried climbing the tree but couldn't get very high. I threw rocks at other trees, trying to improve my aim. I made up stories in my head about being a survivalist living off the land. Around what I guessed was about 11 a.m., I ate one of my granola bars, rationing my food since I didn't know how long I'd be out there. Again, the plan was to stay out there for a full day, but the longer I was out, the more I kind of just wanted to go home. Around noon, I heard footsteps coming from deeper in the woods, not from the direction of my house. The steps sounded human, not like an animal. I thought it might be my parents searching for me, so I called out, "Mom?" The footsteps stopped immediately. Complete silence followed. The sudden stillness was unnerving, like I was being watched by everything in the forest. After that, I got a bit restless. I started to walk around a bit, still staying in the general area but changing positions a few times. I found a small stream and followed it for a while, then circled back to my tree. Eventually, I sat down again, this time facing away from the house and deeper into the forest. About 2 hours later, my Game Boy batteries died in the middle of a battle. Disappointed, I looked up, and when I did, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Standing at the edge of the trees, about 20 feet away from me, was a figure that looked like my mom, or at least had her general shape and build. She was wearing what looked like the blue sweater my mom had put on that morning, but she was positioned in a way that her face was covered in shadows, and something about her stance felt wrong. Her arms hung a bit too low, and she was standing too still. I called out again, "Mom?" The figure nodded slowly and beckoned me with her hand, a similar come here gesture from years before. There was something about it though. The movement was twitchy in a way. I got up and started to walk towards her, already feeling foolish about my plan to run away. I started to apologize, explaining that I was going to come back home, that I just wanted them to notice me more. I rambled on and on about how they never had time for me anymore, how they were always busy with each other or with work. The figure didn't respond, just turned and started to walk deeper into the woods, occasionally looking back and gesturing for me to follow. I followed, but something felt wrong. She was moving too quick, staying just far enough ahead that I couldn't get a good look at her. She never spoke, never responded to my apologies or questions, and she was leading me away from home, into a part of the woods that I didn't recognize. The trees were thicker here, older, with more underbrush that scratched at my legs through my jeans. "Why are you going so fast? Where are we going?" I called out, breaking into a jog to keep up with her. The figure didn't slow or respond, just kept the same pace, always just out of reach. The rational part of my brain started to send warning signals. Why would my mom ignore me? Why would she lead me deeper into the woods instead of just taking me home? But I kept following anyway, partly out of curiosity and partly because I didn't want to admit to myself that something was wrong. I started running, trying my hardest to catch up. I was focused entirely on the figure ahead of me. That's why I didn't see the drop-off until it was too late. The ground suddenly disappeared beneath my feet. I hadn't been watching where I was going, and I'd run straight over the edge of a steep ravine. I tumbled down, hitting rocks and branches before landing hard at the bottom. For a few terrifying seconds, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt compressed, like someone was sitting on it. When my lungs finally started to work again, I gasped in air and immediately started to cough. My whole body ached. I checked myself for broken bones, moving each limb carefully. By some miracle, I was just badly scratched and bruised, with a large gash on my arm that was bleeding but not too deeply. If I'd fallen a little differently, I could have broken my neck. I could have died. Disoriented and scared, I looked around. The ravine was about 15 feet deep, with steep sides of loose dirt and rock. At the bottom was a dry creek bed filled with stones and debris. I didn't recognize anything around me. I had never been this far into the woods before. I tried climbing back up the side I'd fallen down, but it was too steep, and the dirt kept giving way under my feet. My shoes kept slipping on loose rocks, and I fell back down twice, scraping my hands and knees pretty bad. After about 15 minutes of failed attempts, I started to call for my mom and dad, hoping they were out there somewhere looking for me. I shouted until my throat hurt, then sat in silence for half an hour. I waited, listening and hoping for a response. Nothing came back but the occasional bird call or rustle of wind through the trees. I was crying then. I walked to the other side of the ravine, where the slope looked less steep, and I was able to climb out by grabbing onto tree roots and pulling myself up. My plan was to circle around to where the ravine was shallower on both sides, thinking I could find my way back home from there easily. But I quickly realized I was completely lost. Every direction looked the same, just trees and more trees, with no landmarks I recognized. I tried to find the sun to get my bearings, but the forest canopy was too thick. I had no idea which way was north, which way was south, let alone which way led back to my house. I picked a direction and started to walk, hoping to find a trail or a road, anything. I spent hours wandering, screaming for help until my voice was gone. My feet hurt, my scratches stung, and I was getting increasingly desperate. The sun was setting, filtering through the trees in orange streaks, and panic really set in. I'd been in these woods at dusk before, but never this far, never alone. When night fell completely, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no house lights. I couldn't even see the moon through the trees. I tried using my flashlight, but the batteries were weak, and it died after about 20 minutes. Now I was in complete darkness, stumbling around, tripping over roots and rocks. Eventually, I was exhausted and terrified, so I sat down against a tree trunk and cried myself to sleep. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up and it was still dark. At first, I was disoriented still. I felt like I was sitting in someone's lap. My back was against something that wasn't the tree that I'd fallen asleep against. There was a body beneath me, ice cold, someone's legs, like they'd been sitting in a freezer though. Something sharp was moving across my cheek, like a nail or claw gently scraping my skin. The touch was almost tender, but it made my skin crawl. I looked up and saw what appeared to be my mother's silhouette, her familiar hair framing her face, and relief flooded through me. And I whispered, "Mom?" As my eyes adjusted to the dark, I saw that what I was looking at was not my mother at all. The face had a mouth, a wide, stretched smile with no lips. But where the eyes, nose, and eyebrows should have been, there was nothing but smooth and pale skin stretched over her face. The smile widened as I looked at it. I screamed and scrambled away, my heart pounding so hard it could have burst. When I looked back, the figure was gone. I pressed my back against a real tree, trying to control my breathing, straining my eyes to see in the dark, terrified that thing would return. That's when I heard my father's voice in the distance, calling my name. At first I thought it might not be real, but the voice was unmistakably his, deep and slightly hoarse. I'd know that voice from anywhere. I screamed back for him, my voice breaking. He yelled back to me to stay where I was and to just keep calling out. So I did just that, sobbing between shouts. 5 minutes later, flashlight beams cutting through the darkness, I saw my parents running towards me, along with 2 police officers and what looked like search and rescue volunteers. My mother ran to me and wrapped me in her arms, crying as hard as I was, while my dad kept saying, "Oh, thank God," over and over. One of the officers draped a blanket around my shoulders. I was shivering uncontrollably from cold and fear. I apologized repeatedly, telling them I had only meant to run away for a day, not to get lost like this. Through my tears, I mentioned the lady who had made me follow her and gotten me lost. They looked confused, but didn't press me for details then. My dad carried me back through the woods. It took almost an hour to reach our house, which showed how far I'd wandered. At home, paramedics checked me out, cleaning and bandaging my cuts, making sure I didn't have any infections. The police asked me some questions about why I'd run away, but they were gentle about it. I overheard one of them telling my parents they were lucky. A kid my age, lost in those woods overnight. Things could have ended much worse. Later that night, after the police left and I'd been cleaned up and fed, my parents sat on the edge of the bed and asked me about the lady I'd mentioned. I told them about how I thought it was Mom calling me into the woods, about following her to the ravine, about waking up in the lap of something that wasn't my mom and wasn't human. I described that faceless woman. I also told them about the night when I was 5, how it felt similar, and how I now believed the same thing had tried to lure me out the window. I could tell from their expressions they weren't sure whether to believe me, but they were clearly disturbed. Dad's face had gone a bit paler, and Mom kept making the sign of the cross, something she only did when she was truly scared. They made me promise never to go into the woods alone again, and told me that if I ever felt upset or neglected, I should just talk to them directly, instead of running away. I kept that promise. I never went back into those woods by myself, and we moved away from that house a year later, when Dad got a job in another state. Before we left, I overheard Dad talking to a neighbor about other kids who had gone missing in those mountains over the years. Some were found, some weren't. To this day, I don't know what that thing was. Why did it look like my mom? Why did it want me to go with her? I'm completely convinced it wanted to hurt me. It tried to lead me into the woods out the window, and for some reason that didn't work. So it waited for another opportunity when I was older. If you take anything away from this story, take 2 things actually. 1, don't be a silly goose kid and run away from your parents. Talk with them. And 2, don't follow strange entities into the woods of Appalachia. One Ticked Off Gnome, from Ted's Me Dodd. Growing up, bonfires were pretty much a staple of our family gatherings. My uncle, who I refer to as Lester for this story, was especially fond of them. He'd come over at least once a month when the weather was good, bring a cooler of Budweiser, and stack wood for a fire that would burn well into the night. The gatherings were usually just my parents, Uncle Lester, sometimes his on-again, off-again girlfriend Sherry, and a rotating cast of neighbors or coworkers my dad would invite. They'd sit in lawn chairs around the fire, drinking beer, and Uncle Lester would eventually pull out his beat-up acoustic guitar. He wasn't particularly good, but after everyone had a few beers, nobody seemed to mind. As a kid, I was rarely allowed to stay out there for the whole thing. Mom would let me hang around till about 9. I would roast marshmallows and listen to the grown-ups talk, but then it was bedtime. I'd argue every time, but it never worked. There was drinking and what my mom called adult conversation, which was basically just them cussing more freely and telling stories I probably shouldn't hear. There was one night that stuck in my memory. I must have been around 8. It was summer and I'd been sent to bed as usual, while the bonfire was still going strong. My bedroom window faced the backyard, so I could still hear them laughing and talking. I remember just lying awake and listening to them. Eventually, the voices dwindled as people headed home or went to bed. But I could still hear my dad and Uncle Lester out there, their voices low as they kept drinking by the fire. I was almost asleep when I heard something different. Yelling, not angry but alarmed, and the sound of people running around the yard. I got up and looked out the window, but it was too dark to see much beyond the glow of the dying bonfire. I could hear them running across the yard, laughing but also a little scared, and then the back door slammed open and shut. There was some running inside the house, and the sound of the door being locked. After a moment of silence, I heard both Dad and Uncle Lester suddenly burst into laughter. That kind of uncontrollable laughter, where you can barely catch your breath. I rolled my eyes, thinking they were silly, and eventually went to sleep. This became one of those odd childhood memories that surfaces on occasion but eventually fades with time. Fast forward, I'm 35 now with my own family. We were having Uncle Lester over recently for dinner. It was movie night and the kids wanted to watch Sonic the Hedgehog. Lester was getting up there in age, but loved coming to see the kids. He was gray-haired now, but still had that same mischievous grin. He sprawled out on my couch with a beer in hand. About halfway through the movie, something triggered that old memory. Not sure what it was, but yeah. I said, "Hey, Uncle Lester, remember those bonfires you guys used to have at my parents' place?" He nodded his head and swigged his beer, saying those were good times. I said to him, "I remember this one night when I was a kid. I remember hearing you and Dad running into the house, like something was chasing you. I heard you laugh, too, but you also sounded a bit creeped out." Lester's eyebrows shot up. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "Holy crap, you remember that?" We looked at the kids, who were thankfully absorbed in the movie. Sorry. Wow, I can't believe you remember that night. I was wanting to know, what happened to you two? He laughed and shook his head. "Well, you won't believe it, but whatever." He took another drink, then went on. "Your dad and I were the last ones out there drinking too many beers, telling work stories. Anyway, we were sitting there, fires burning low, and we're pretty well buzzed. Then, out of nowhere, and believe me or not, it's your choice, this little man comes running out of the woods." "A little man?" I laughed. "Yep, not a kid, a man, but tiny, maybe 2.5 feet tall. He was wearing a pointed green hat and had a long nose. And his ears," he gestured with his hands. "They had these big lobes, stretched out like those folks who use gauges in their ears or whatever. He came running straight at us, mad as heck, yelling in some language I couldn't understand. Sounded like he was cursing up a storm, though. You can tell when someone's cursing you out, no matter what language it is." "You're pulling my leg," I told him. "Swear to God," Lester said, even holding his hand up like he was taking an oath. "Ask your dad next time you see him. That little fella chased us around the fire pit. We were scared crapless, but also laughing, because it was so dang weird. Finally, we made a break for the house and locked the door behind us." I asked him what he thought it was. "Look, nobody around here is that small, not even the kids. And this wasn't no kid. Your dad and I discussed it well after. Thought maybe we imagined it, or mistook some sort of small animal for it. Even so, we both described the same thing." I wasn't sure what to say after that. It sounded like they got pretty drunk, and probably imagined it. But Uncle Lester thought it was real. Says he never saw anything like it before or since. We went out there the next morning to look around, hungover and everything. But there was nothing. No footprints, not a trace. The kids cheered at something on the TV, breaking the moment. Lester winked at me and turned back to the movie. Ooh boy, gotta say, those were some of the best stories I've gotten in a while. Well done to the folks who sent those in.
get you oriented with the area. He gestured toward a bank of metal lockers along the far wall. Number 37 is yours. Combinations written on the card there. I followed him over, noting how the other rangers seemed to give us space without making it obvious. New guy treatment, probably. I'd been through it before in different jobs. David handed me a small index card with the combination and walked me through the standard equipment checklist: radio, first aid kit, flashlight, emergency flares, the usual ranger gear. Uniform shirts are in there, along with some department manuals and safety protocols, he said, already glancing at his clipboard like he had a dozen other things to handle. Take your time getting settled. Your first patrol starts at 7 tonight. We'll have you doing evening rounds near Old Faithful to get a feel for visitor interactions. He moved off to deal with another ranger's question, leaving me alone with my new locker. I spun the combination lock and pulled the door open, expecting to find exactly what he described. The uniforms hung neatly on hooks, and a stack of manuals sat on the upper shelf. But taped to the inside of the locker door was a piece of paper I definitely hadn't expected. Someone had written on it in careful, precise handwriting, the kind of penmanship that looked like every letter had been formed with intention. Rules for Yellowstone Rangers. Night shift. 1. If you see a pale figure in the woods during your patrol, do not look directly at it. Say, "I'm just here to ensure the safety of campers," and turn your back. Do not run. 2. If the forest goes completely silent, no birds, insects, or wind, stop moving immediately. Do not take another step until normal sounds return. 3. Avoid anyone wearing yellow rain jackets in groups of 4 or more. Make an excuse and leave the area quickly. 4. Never follow the sound of a child crying, no matter how distressed they sound. Stay on marked trails. 5. If someone knocks on your cabin door after 11 p.m., do not answer. Do not look out the windows. Stay in bed until sunrise. These are not suggestions. Your life depends on following them exactly. I stared at the paper for a long moment, reading through the list twice. My first instinct was to laugh. Classic rookie hazing, make the new guy paranoid about mysterious forest creatures and unexplained dangers. Every job had its version of this. The police department had been full of stories designed to mess with fresh recruits, urban legends about haunted patrol routes and cursed evidence lockers. I crumpled the paper and tossed it toward a nearby trash can. But something made me pause. The handwriting bothered me. It wasn't the sloppy scrawl of someone playing a prank. Each word had been written with care, like the person took the message seriously. The paper itself looked like it had been there for a while, the tape edges slightly yellowed. I walked over and picked the crumpled note out of the trash, smoothing it against my thigh. And there was something about the tone, direct, urgent, almost desperate. Who wrote warnings about staying in bed until sunrise as a gag? I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. Maybe I was overthinking it, but 7 years of police work had taught me to pay attention when something felt off. Even if this turned out to be an elaborate prank, keeping the rules wouldn't hurt anything. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of orientation materials and equipment checks. David introduced me to other members of the ranger staff, walked me through the radio protocols, and gave me a basic rundown of the park layout. Everyone seemed professional and helpful, though I noticed nobody mentioned the note in my locker. If this was a team effort to mess with the new guy, they were playing it straight. By evening, I felt reasonably confident about handling a basic patrol. The Old Faithful area was one of the most visited parts of the park, which meant plenty of people around and well-marked paths. Good place to start, especially for someone used to urban environments, where backup was never more than a few minutes away. I loaded my gear into one of the park trucks and headed out as the sun started to drop behind the mountains. The geyser basin looked different in the fading light, less touristy, more wild. Visitors were heading back to their accommodations, leaving behind the boardwalks and thermal features that drew millions of people every year. Soon it would just be me, the landscape, and whatever nocturnal wildlife called this place home. The first few hours went smoothly. I checked on a few late campers, made sure the restroom facilities were secure, and got used to the patrol route. The radio stayed quiet except for routine check-ins from other rangers. Nothing unusual, nothing that required the kind of split-second decision-making I'd grown accustomed to in police work. Around 10:30, I was walking a section of trail that wound through a grove of lodgepole pines when I saw it. The figure stood motionless between the trees, maybe 50 yards off the main path. At first, it looked like a person, tall, wearing what might have been light-colored clothing. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the proportions began to seem wrong. Too tall, definitely. And the limbs looked stretched, like someone had taken a normal human body and pulled it upward, until everything became unnaturally long. My training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, determine if this was a lost hiker or something else entirely. I took a step forward, squinting to get a better look, when the figure began to turn in my direction. That's when the rules from my locker came flooding back. If you see a pale figure in the woods during your patrol, do not look directly at it. I jerked my head to the side, focusing on a spot of ground near my feet instead of the thing between the trees. But I forced myself to remember the rest of the instruction. "I'm just here to ensure the safety of campers," I said, loud enough to carry across the distance. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Turn your back. Do not run." Every instinct I had screamed against turning away from a potential threat. Police training had drilled into me the importance of maintaining visual contact, of never presenting your back to an unknown situation. But the memory of that careful handwriting held me in place. Someone had written those rules with absolute conviction, and something about the figure ahead made my skin crawl in ways that had nothing to do with rational fear. I turned around slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. Behind me, the night felt suddenly heavy. No footsteps, no rustling branches, no sound of movement at all. Just the terrible feeling of being watched by something that shouldn't exist. Minutes passed. I counted them off in my head, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder or break into a run. The rules had been specific about not running, and at this point I was prepared to follow them exactly. Whatever was behind me, running felt like it would trigger something I didn't want to deal with. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It felt physical, like pressure against the back of my neck. I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, focusing on my breathing and my radio. Normal things, real things that made sense. When I finally turned around, the grove was empty. I stood there for several more minutes, looking around the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. Whatever I'd seen was gone, leaving behind only the quiet sounds of a normal forest night. Insects buzzing, branches creaking in the breeze, the distant call of an owl, all perfectly ordinary. I finished my patrol without incident, but the folded piece of paper in my pocket felt important. By the time I returned to the ranger station, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 hours earlier. The rules weren't a prank, and I was going to follow them. I woke up with the memory of those long arms burned into my mind. Sleep had come in pieces, broken up every hour or so by the picture of that thing standing still between the trees. Rolling out of my narrow bunk, I caught myself checking the windows before getting dressed. Nothing there except morning forest and mountains, but the worry stuck around. My second day at Yellowstone started with the same routine briefing at the ranger station. Other rangers moved through their morning preparations with the easy confidence of people who belonged here. I envied that feeling. Coffee helped, but not enough to get rid of the questions spinning in my head. David Wilson stood near the duty board, updating assignments like he always did. I walked over to him during a quiet moment in the morning chaos, when most of the other rangers had headed out for their shifts. "David, I wanted to ask about the ranger who had my position before me." His pen stopped moving across the clipboard. The change was subtle, but immediate. His shoulders tensed, and he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Uncomfortable, maybe. Definitely guarded. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, returning his attention to the duty roster. She quit about 3 weeks ago. Any particular reason? Personal decision. He flipped to another page, clearly hoping to end the conversation. She had excellent performance reviews, never caused any problems, just decided the position wasn't for her anymore. The words came out too practiced, like he'd rehearsed this response. I'd heard that tone plenty of times during police interviews. People trying to give just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything meaningful. Did she give notice? She submitted her resignation on a Friday afternoon and cleaned out her desk the same day. David's pen clicked against the clipboard in a steady rhythm, left everything in good order, very professional. 3 weeks. That meant her locker had been sitting empty for almost a month before I arrived. Plenty of time for someone to remove anything personal or sensitive. But apparently not enough time for someone to take down the rules taped inside the door. I see. I waited to see if he'd volunteer anything else, but David had already moved on to studying weather reports with focused attention. The conversation was over. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing park maps and getting used to radio protocols. Normal ranger work, the kind of preparation that made sense regardless of what might be hiding in the forests after dark. But the image of that pale figure kept interrupting my concentration, and I found myself thinking about Sarah Mitchell's sudden departure. Excellent performance reviews and no explanation. Someone who took pride in her work based on how she'd left everything organized, but who walked away from her job without warning. The timing bothered me too. 3 weeks ago meant she'd quit right around the end of summer season, when rangers would normally be preparing for autumn duties and fewer visitors. My afternoon assignment took me to Lamar Valley, a section of the park known for wildlife viewing and camping. The drive out gave me time to appreciate the landscape in daylight, rolling grasslands surrounded by mountains. The kind of scenery that drew millions of visitors every year. Hard to imagine anything scary in such an openly beautiful place. I found the family of campers I was supposed to check on without any trouble. Standard stuff, making sure they had proper food storage, confirming their camping permits were in order, answering questions about trail conditions. A couple from Minnesota with 2 teenage kids, all of them friendly and well-prepared. The kind of visitors who made the job pleasant. Are there any dangerous animals we should watch for? The father asked as I finished reviewing their permit. Bears and wolves, I said automatically. Keep food in the bear boxes, don't approach wildlife, stay on marked trails, standard precautions. The family nodded and thanked me for the information. I was turning to head back to my truck when it happened. The forest went silent. Not gradually, not the way sounds might fade during a normal lull in activity. One moment I could hear birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the breeze. The next moment, complete quiet. No bird songs, no insect buzz, no wind through the trees. Even the family behind me seemed to fall silent, though I couldn't tell if they'd noticed the change or were simply caught up in the same unnatural hush. My right foot was in the air, mid-step toward the parking area. The second rule flashed through my memory with perfect clarity. If the forest goes completely silent, stop moving immediately. Do not take another step until normal sounds return. I froze, balancing awkwardly with one foot raised, feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. Every muscle in my body wanted to complete the step, to move normally, to pretend nothing unusual was happening. But the silence pressed against my ears like physical weight, and something deep in my survival instinct screamed warnings I didn't understand. Behind me, one of the teenagers said something to his parents, but even their voices sounded muffled and wrong, like they were speaking through thick glass. The normal acoustics of the outdoors had vanished completely. Minutes crawled by. My raised leg started to ache, then burn, but I held the position. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt loaded with potential, like the moment before lightning strikes. My police training had taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, and everything about this situation set off every alarm bell I'd developed over 7 years of urban patrol. A bead of sweat rolled down my spine. The family was definitely talking now, their voices carrying that particular tone people used when they were trying to decide if they should be concerned about something. I wanted to reassure them, to explain that I was just being cautious, but the rules had been specific about not moving. 6 minutes, 7, 8. My legs shook with the effort of maintaining balance, and I started to worry about falling over. But the silence held, thick and oppressive, making the normal world feel impossibly distant. Then, faint and far away, I heard a single bird chirp. The sound was like a crack in a dam. Within seconds, the normal symphony of forest noise came flooding back. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling, birds calling to each other across the valley. The oppressive weight lifted from the air, and suddenly I could breathe properly again. I lowered my foot to the ground, trying to make the movement look casual. My leg nearly buckled, but I managed to stay upright. Behind me, the family was discussing whether they'd seen a bear or elk, apparently having missed the acoustic anomaly entirely. "Everything okay, Ranger?" the father called. "Just listening for wildlife," I said, surprised by how normal my voice sounded. "You folks have a good afternoon." I walked back to my truck on wobbly legs, nodding goodbye to the family while my mind went through what had just happened. 10 minutes of complete quiet in the middle of a busy ecosystem. No bears, no predators, no clear reason why every living thing in the area would suddenly stop making noise. Except it wasn't without explanation. Someone had written specific instructions about exactly this situation, and those instructions had just saved me from what? I had no idea what would have happened if I'd kept walking, but the feeling that it would have been bad settled into my bones. The drive back to the ranger station passed in a blur of questions I couldn't answer. By the time I parked in the employee lot, one thing had become clear. The rules weren't a prank. Sarah Mitchell had left them for a reason, and whatever she'd experienced during her time here had been real enough to make her quit a job she was apparently good at. The station buzzed with typical late afternoon activity. Rangers returning from patrols, updating logs, preparing for evening duty. I moved through the routine check-in procedures automatically, my mind focused on a single goal. I needed to find out more about Sarah Mitchell, and her desk seemed like the logical place to start. The office area held 6 desks arranged in 2 rows, each one equipped with a computer terminal and filing drawers. David pointed out Sarah's old workspace during my first day tour, mentioning it would probably be reassigned soon. Located in the back corner, it had a clear view of the duty board and radio station, but felt somehow cut off from the main flow of activity. I waited until most of the other rangers had finished their paperwork and headed home. David left around 5:30, reminding me to lock up when I finished my reports. By 6 o'clock, I was alone in the station with Sarah's abandoned desk. The surface was clean, no personal items, no scattered papers, nothing to suggest someone had once worked there regularly. But the drawers told a different story. Sarah had been thorough about clearing out obvious personal belongings, but she'd left behind the kind of routine paperwork that built up in any job. Duty rosters from earlier in the summer, equipment checklists, copies of incident reports. I flipped through the incident reports first, expecting to find the usual range of ranger business. Lost hikers, wildlife encounters, medical emergencies, traffic violations. Instead, I found something much more interesting. Sarah had been documenting patterns. Not officially, these weren't the kind of reports that would go into permanent files or administrative reviews. These were personal notes, written in the same careful handwriting I'd seen on the rules in my locker. June 15th. Weather problem during patrol near Fishing Bridge. Complete quiet lasting approximately 8 minutes. No visible wildlife activity during event. June 23rd. Campers report strange person seen near thermal features after midnight. Unable to locate source of sighting during follow-up investigation. July 2nd. Radio interference during evening patrol. Voices claiming to be other rangers requesting assistance, but duty roster shows all personnel accounted for at other locations. July 18th. Wildlife behavioral problems seen in Lamar Valley. Elk herd ran away suddenly with no apparent cause. Complete stop of bird activity for 12 minutes. The reports continued through August, becoming more frequent and more detailed. Sarah had been tracking something, multiple incidents involving quiet, strange people, false radio calls, and animals acting scared. She'd noted dates, times, locations, weather conditions, someone building a case for something she couldn't officially report. The final entry was dated August 29th, 3 days before her resignation. Partner still missing. Official search called off after 72 hours. I know what happened to him, but I can't prove it, and no one would believe me anyway. The rules work. Follow them exactly. Trust nothing that seems wrong, even if it looks known. I read that last entry 3 times, feeling pieces of a puzzle slide into place. Sarah hadn't quit because she didn't like the job. She'd quit because someone she cared about had gone missing, and she knew something about the circumstances that she couldn't share through official channels. The rules weren't just protection. They were a warning based on direct experience. Sarah had figured out how to survive whatever was happening in this park, and she'd left instructions for whoever came after her. I gathered the incident reports and slipped them into my jacket. David might wonder where they'd gone eventually, but Sarah had clearly intended them to be found by the right person. Someone who would take them seriously instead of dismissing them as stress-related paranoia. That evening, alone in my cabin, I spread Sarah's reports across my small table and read through them again. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Incidents clustered around certain areas, specific times when normal rules seemed to break down, entities that could copy human voices and appearances. I pulled the folded rules from my pocket and smoothed them out beside the reports. Every instruction corresponded to something Sarah had documented. The pale person, the unnatural, quiet, false distress calls, things that appeared human but weren't. She'd learned these lessons the hard way, losing someone important in the process. Now she was gone too, but she'd left behind everything I needed to avoid making the same mistakes. I refolded the rules and put them back in my pocket, but this time, they felt different. Not like a prank or curiosity, but like a lifeline. Sarah Mitchell had spent her final weeks at Yellowstone trying to protect whoever would take her place, documenting threats that couldn't be officially acknowledged and creating guidelines that might keep another ranger alive. I had no idea what I was really dealing with, but I knew enough to follow her advice exactly. Tomorrow night, I'd be back on patrol, and when something impossible appeared in my path, I'd be ready for it. I'd spent the last 2 days going through Sarah's incident reports again and again, memorizing dates and locations until the pattern burned itself into my mind. What she'd documented settled over me like a heavy coat, one I couldn't take off now that I understood what I was really dealing with. Sleep came easier knowing I had her rules to follow, but my dreams were filled with tall figures and missing partners whose faces I'd never seen. 2 days of normal patrols had given me a false sense of security. I'd started to hope that maybe the strange encounters came in waves, that I might get weeks of regular ranger work between incidents. That hope disappeared completely during what should have been a routine morning. Mammoth Hot Springs drew visitors year-round for its terraced limestone formations and steaming pools. The camping area nearby required regular inspection, making sure people followed food storage regulations, checking permits, ensuring nobody was camping too close to the thermal features. Standard stuff that let me focus on the job, instead of looking around every tree line for things that shouldn't exist. I was walking between designated campsites, clipboard in hand, when I spotted them near the northern edge of the camping area. 4 people wearing identical bright yellow rain jackets, standing in a loose cluster near a picnic table. The morning was clear and warm, not a cloud in the sky, which made their choice of outerwear seem odd from the start. But it wasn't the jackets themselves that made my stomach clench. It was how they moved. I stopped beside a large pine tree, pretending to check something on my clipboard while watching them through my peripheral vision. They changed positions like they were connected by invisible strings. When one turned left, they all turned left. When one took a step forward, they all took the same step at exactly the same moment. The timing was perfect in a way that human movement never quite achieved. Their conversation drifted across the campsite, and even from 30 yards away, I could tell something was wrong with it. The words came at regular intervals, like people reading from a script. No natural pauses, no interruptions, no overlapping voices. Each person spoke their lines and waited for the next person to speak theirs. "The weather is very nice today," one of them said. "Yes, it is perfect for hiking," another responded. "We should visit the thermal pools before we leave." That is a good idea for our group. I'd heard plenty of tourist conversations over the past few days, and none of them sounded like that. People talked over each other, changed subjects mid-sentence, laughed at inappropriate moments. This felt like watching actors who'd never learned how normal human interaction worked. Then they noticed me. All four heads turned in my direction at the same time, and I felt their stare like physical pressure against my skin. Their faces were completely ordinary, middle-aged hikers, the kind of people you'd see at any national park. But their eyes held an intensity that made my mouth go dry. They weren't looking at me the way tourists looked at rangers. They were studying me, evaluating me like predators deciding whether I was worth their attention. The third rule blazed through my memory. Avoid anyone wearing yellow rain jackets in groups of 4 or more. Make an excuse and leave the area quickly. I raised my radio to my mouth, keeping my movements casual. "Base, this is Thompson. I've got a priority radio check needed back at the station. I'll be heading in shortly." The radio crackled with static, but I didn't wait for a response. I clicked it back onto my belt and started walking toward the parking area, fighting every instinct that told me to run. The rules had been specific about leaving quickly, but they hadn't said anything about running. Given what I'd learned about the pale figure, I suspected sudden movement might trigger something I didn't want to deal with. The feeling of being watched followed me all the way to my truck. I could feel their eyes tracking my movements, but I didn't look back to confirm it. Whatever those things were wearing yellow jackets, they'd decided I wasn't worth pursuing. The knowledge should have been comforting, but it only raised more questions about what would have happened if I'd approached them directly. I drove away from Mammoth Hot Springs with my hands gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary, trying to process what I'd just seen. 4 entities that looked human, but moved like they shared a single brain, standing in bright sunlight, wearing rain gear for weather that didn't exist, having conversations that sounded like they'd been assembled from a tourist phrase book. My afternoon assignment took me to a remote section of the Grand Loop Road, the main route that connected most of Yellowstone's major attractions. This stretch ran through dense forest with minimal traffic, perfect for checking on backcountry conditions and making sure no one had left trash or illegal campsites along the roadside. I was walking a maintenance trail about half a mile from where I'd parked when I heard it. A child's voice, high and desperate, calling from somewhere deep in the trees to my left. "Help! Please! Somebody help me!" The sound hit me like a physical blow. 7 years of police work had trained me to respond immediately to distress calls, especially when they involved kids. Every protective instinct I'd developed screamed at me to drop everything and run toward that voice. A child was lost, scared, possibly hurt, and I was the only person in the area who could help. "I'm lost. I can't find my mommy and daddy." The voice was heartbreaking, exactly the kind of fear and confusion you'd expect from a young child separated from their parents in the wilderness. It carried clearly through the trees, coming from maybe 100 yards off the trail. Close enough that I could reach them in a few minutes, far enough that they'd never find their way back to the road without help. I took 2 steps toward the tree line before Sarah's 4th rule stopped me cold. Never follow the sound of a child crying, no matter how distressed they sound. Stay on marked trails. The internal war that followed nearly tore me apart. Everything about that voice sounded genuine. The terror, the desperation, the specific way children spoke when they were overwhelmed and frightened. If this was a real kid, and I ignored them because of some paranoid set of rules, I'd never forgive myself. But if Sarah was right, if this was another mimicry designed to lure people away from safety, then following that voice would end with me joining her missing partner. "Please, it's getting dark and I'm scared." I closed my eyes and forced myself to stay on the trail. The voice wasn't coming from a small child lost in the woods. It was coming from something that had learned to copy the sound of human distress, and it was using that knowledge to trick the natural protective instincts that kept people alive in normal circumstances. The crying continued for over an hour as I completed my patrol. Sometimes it seemed to move closer to the trail, as if whatever was making the sound was trying to position itself where I couldn't ignore it. The distress in the voice never got better. If anything, it became more desperate as time passed, adding new details about being hungry and cold, about hearing strange noises in the woods. But I noticed something else that confirmed what I'd suspected. In the direction of that voice, the forest was completely silent. No birds sang in the trees where the crying came from. No insects buzzed in the plants. Even the normal rustling of small animals moving through leaves was missing from that area, as if every living thing with working survival instincts had run away. Whatever was making those sounds, the actual wildlife wanted nothing to do with it. By the time I returned to my truck, the voice had gone quiet in the distance. Whether it had given up on me or moved on to find easier prey, I didn't know. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline finally worked its way out of my system. Following that voice would have felt like the right thing to do, the human thing to do. Instead, I'd stood on a trail and listened to what sounded like a terrified child for over an hour without offering help. The drive back to the ranger station gave me time to think about what Sarah must have gone through. Building her collection of incident reports, learning to recognize patterns that made no logical sense, watching normal protective instincts become liabilities that could get you killed. No wonder she'd quit. The real question was how she'd lasted as long as she did. At the station, I went through the motions of filing my patrol report and updating equipment logs, normal administrative tasks that felt strange after what I'd experienced. The other rangers worked around me with easy familiarity, discussing visitor complaints and maintenance schedules like this was any other job in any other place. I waited until most of them had finished their paperwork and headed home. The station grew quiet as evening came, leaving me alone with filing cabinets full of official documentation that probably didn't mention anything really important. Sarah's incident reports had been hidden in her desk drawer, personal notes that never made it into permanent records. If she'd left behind anything else, it wouldn't be somewhere obvious. The training manuals filled an entire shelf near the back of the station. Basic ranger procedures, wildlife management protocols, emergency response guidelines, the kind of reference materials that built up in any workplace. Most of them looked like they hadn't been touched in years, thick binders covered with dust and organized by topics that rarely came up in day-to-day operations. I pulled down a manual labeled Backcountry Safety Procedures and flipped through pages of standard warnings about bears, weather hazards, and medical emergencies. Nothing unusual until I reached the section on radio protocols. There, tucked between pages discussing communication procedures, were several sheets of paper covered with Sarah's careful handwriting. These notes were different from the incident reports I'd found in her desk, more detailed, more personal, and significantly more disturbing. The voices are getting better at copying specific people. Yesterday, I heard Mark calling for help near Shoshone Lake, but Mark was at the visitor center giving guided tours all afternoon. When I investigated, I found footprints that started human and gradually became something else, longer, with too many joints in the foot. The crying child phenomenon appears most frequently near thermal features and along remote sections of the Grand Loop Road. I've tested this by playing recordings of actual children in distress, and the local wildlife reacts completely differently. When real children cry, birds become agitated and animals move toward the sound to investigate. When the fake crying starts, everything goes silent and leaves the area. I think I understand what happened to David now. 3 weeks ago, he followed what he thought was a lost girl into the woods near Artist Point. The search team found his radio and badge scattered along a game trail, but no other trace. What they didn't find, what I didn't report, was the thing wearing his face and uniform that tried to get me to come closer. It knew his name, his assignment, details about our relationship that no one else would have known. But it couldn't quite get his voice right. Too much emphasis on the wrong syllables, like something trying to speak English as a second language. The papers included sketches that made my skin crawl, footprint progressions showing human tracks gradually getting longer and developing additional toe joints, diagrams of thermal areas where the crying phenomenon happened most frequently, maps marking locations where rangers and visitors had gone missing over the past 5 years, with notes about false distress calls reported in those areas. The final page was a letter that she'd never intended to send. To whoever reads this, I can't stay here anymore. David is gone, and I know what took him. But I can't prove it, and no one would believe me anyway. The things in this park have learned to use our protective instincts against us. They copy the voices and appearances of people in distress, and when we respond the way we're trained to respond, we disappear. The rules I left in Locker 37 will keep you alive if you follow them exactly. Don't try to be a hero.